The End of April is a mystery, thriller, horror drama that follows Hyunjin, a woman in her early 20s who moves into a rundown apartment while studying for the civil service exams. But shortly after moving in, she starts hearing and seeing strange things that may or may not be there, as her constant studies have left her sleep-deprived and perhaps even somewhat delirious. Which might sound like a rather generic premise when it comes to the horror genre, but it's not so much a cliched or scary in-your-face horror movie. Instead, it's more of a psychological one that utilizes a slow pace to create a level of mystery and build an unsettling atmosphere surrounding this apartment complex and this newest resident. When the movie begins, it doesn't take long to feel a sense of uneasiness, as there's quite noticeably a few things that feel out of place. And with mold growing on the ceiling and a noisy and rude next door neighbor, it doesn't exactly make for the best living environment. However, it also doesn't take long to observe that Hyunjin may not be the most reliable perspective to follow, as she witnesses a murder and then, almost instantly, sees the victim alive in front of her, which quickly makes you question whether or not these strange sights and sounds are actually happening, or if she's just hallucinating it all as a result of her deteriorating mental state. But as the movie opens its doors to other characters and begins to expand on the story and focus on scenes involving a teenage girl who lives next door and an older woman who works as a social worker, it not only adds more depth to the story, environment, and the mystery and horror elements, but it also makes things more interesting when there are instances of other characters who corroborate what Hyunjin is seeing or hearing, which works to continuously increase the level of intrigue and makes you wonder what parts are real and what parts aren't, while simultaneously throwing you off and wanting you to question what exactly is the significance of all these strange incidents and whether or not it has a deeper metaphorical meaning tied to this character and her story. It's a very engaging aspect that works really well with the slower pace, as the movie primarily relies on visually communicating ideas to allow you to fill in the silence with your own thoughts and form your own picture of what's actually going on. Therefore, it's important that you pay attention because it can be quite confusing at times, as a lot of crucial information is delivered quite subtly, with a few exceptions that serve to be a bit more direct. So when it comes to the mystery aspect, I think it's really nicely implemented, with quite a fascinating approach to the presentation and direction, as it doesn't hold your hand and instead quietly gives you enough information and time to really try and piece everything together to better understand the movie before it reaches its conclusion. And you definitely need to be mindful of what's going on to get the most out of the mystery and everything else the movie has to offer. As for the horror, it's pretty light for the most part in terms of anything that might be visually scary, as it's mainly driven by surreal and dark undertone that plays off of ideas tied to Hyunjin's mental state. But it maintains the atmosphere well and works in service of the mystery and drama, while also offering some pretty horrific and disturbing ideas that are grounded in reality, as well as a handful of creepy and tense moments in confined spaces that creates a level of discomfort and makes you concerned for the character in that situation. So it's definitely an interesting blend of elements to say the least, and it manages to keep things engaging while the movie is slowly building on the drama. Though, strangely enough, towards the second half, the direction of the movie briefly shifts away from this eerie nature as it introduces a romantic angle that kind of feels a bit distant from everything else the movie has offered so far. It might even take you out of the movie a bit as the atmosphere briefly lightens up. but while it may initially seem somewhat out of place in a movie that carries a sense of uneasiness mixed in with the perception of uncertainty, it's surprisingly a very profound aspect that conveys a more intimate side to Hyunjin and further complements the underlying psychological aspect. Even more so when you reflect on all the ideas and perspectives the movie brings to the table. And I think being able to reflect on and recontextualize certain scenes is necessary for the viewing experience, as it's a very layered movie with a lot of different components that feels quite cleverly put together for the most part. That being said, this is also more of a small-scale, low-budget indie production, so there are some aspects that could have used a bit more polish, or perhaps aren't as fully realized as you'd anticipate. But I still think it's a pretty good movie overall, and an impressive first feature film from director Kim Kwang-Bok, as he nicely utilizes a balance of genres to deliver an interesting and often tense experience that almost relies on you forming your own interpretation, as it tells a layered and troubled story paired up with some good performances from the cast, as Park Ji-Soo and Lee Bit-na do well to lead the movie. It's definitely not going to be a movie for everyone, but if you're a fan of movies with a more ambiguous and hands-off approach and style of direction, then I would highly recommend watching this movie, and it's currently available to stream for free on On Demand Korea.